how would I define consciousness? A simple question like that. But I think the simplest answer I could give would be that I see consciousness as sort of a primary or primordial organizing principle of the universe. That would be with a capital C, but with a little c, it's the organizing principle that guides my experience and creates my experience through that organization. When we started the PEAR Lab, we thought we were just studying an engineering problem, whether engineering systems are susceptible to malfunction as a result of the consciousness of their human operators. And at that time, when we talked about consciousness, I think we had a more mundane concept. But when we started seeing the results and we started hearing people describe their experiences, and as we attempted to try to understand what was going on, it became more and more clear that we were looking at something that was a lot more profound than just my cognitive processes or my personal intention. When people would talk about the resonance, the sense of connection they felt with the experiments, you know, I think that understanding or awareness grew gradually. Clearly, the experiments with opposite sex pairs, where we found that people who had a resonance with each other seemed to create resonance. And, you know, resonance is literally being on the same wavelength. So it kind of grew out of that, and that realization, when you start being on the same wavelength and you start talking about resonance, it's a very small step to talk about love. And when you're talking about love, you can talk about love with a big L, and you realize this is big stuff. This is not just a pragmatic engineering question. This is what is going on. How do we create our reality? What is the role of our consciousness, not our brains, our consciousness, in creating and designing the reality that we experience? Well, a lot of people are curious about the relationship of mind and matter and mind over matter. I don't think it's a question of mind over matter. You know, frequently people refer to this as the hard question. People frequently speak of the mind-body problem. I have come to the conclusion that there really isn't a mind-body problem. If you have a mind that has no body, that's a problem. If you have a body that has no mind, that's a problem. If you have a mind and a body working together, you have life. No problem. This is that fundamental. Our minds and our bodies are so interconnected, you can't separate them out. And if our bodies and our minds are extended beyond our own local little reality to other people, to the environment, no problem. The effects, as I think I mentioned this morning, tend to be very small. But they repeat and they compound. And then you see an effect that you wouldn't have seen on a very small level. You know, they talk about, I think the example might be termites. They say if you take a single termite and put it down on the ground, it'll just wander aimlessly around. And if you bring another termite in, they'll both wander aimlessly around, and every once in a while they'll come and they'll connect with their little antennas. And then you bring in a few more termites, and at some point you reach a critical mass of termites, and they start building a nest, and they know collectively, they know precisely how to do it. They don't have to go to nest building school. It is inherent there, but you have to have this level of collective awareness. I think that's true of all of us. I think we have a collective level. And most of us are wandering around like this, but when we encounter another being and we start doing this, we set up these resonances. We call it friendship, call it love, call it relationship. And as this grows and as you build from a relationship to a community, I think there is a knowledge and a wisdom that comes at that community level, just as there is on the termite level, that none of us individually have full access to. We may get a little inkling sometimes of something, yeah, there's something more. But I think when we start becoming a global consciousness, we tap into the bigger consciousness as well, with the big C. And everything sort of falls into place because that's the organizational principle. And it can create whatever reality it chooses. Since we changed the lab, I think I have seen changes, but not necessarily within the scientific community. There is still a very strong resistance among the mainstream science to these topics. It's a peculiar question, and I don't know fully the answer, but at some level, I think mainstream science is threatened by work like this because it challenges the reality, the paradigm that they base their own identities on. I remember a conversation with a physicist who said to me, you know, if you're right in what you're doing, then everything I've done will be wrong. And I said, no, it would just be incomplete. And he said, no, you don't understand. I'd be wrong. Where was that coming from? I mean, that was one very nervous physicist. And I think our science today is more involved with trying to maintain and defend the structure that on which the scientific community survives than it is upon doing science and learning new things and expanding our understanding. I think the work we're doing is a threat to that. I think it's first of all saying that the reality that you have described is only partial. And scientists basically like something absolute. They want something that's very predictive, very, if you do A, B will happen. And the study of consciousness is just shot through with uncertainty and paradox and randomness. So if you can't deal with that, if you can't deal with I don't know or I was wrong, you're going to find this work very discomforting. There is a part of me that I think ever since I was quite young, not worried, but wondered about, why am I here? Is there some purpose to all of this? I tended to be, and still tend to be, a generalist. I am very interested, as you mentioned, in the way different perspectives come together to create a larger picture. The relationship that I had with Bob John, Bob was a specialist. He was somebody who understood things in depth, but it was a much more precisely focused knowledge. There was something, when we got together, there was something that we both were growing as a result. And again, I can't pinpoint, well, I can pinpoint it to a very early conversation we had where he asked me, what do you think is going on in this business? And I tried to explain it, waving my hands, running off at the mouth. And he listened, and afterwards he nodded. He said, that's very interesting. Do you know about covalent bonds? And I said, no, what's a covalent bond? And he started to explain about how the two entities can come together and form a molecule, and that somehow the energy of that molecule is greater than the energy of the two atoms. And as we're having this conversation, I started to laugh, and I said, you physicists have the answer, but you don't know what the question is. I know what the question is, but I'm looking for the answer. And I think our two approaches complemented each other so well that both of us grew, and out of our dialogue and our exchange, the program emerged that we could look at from both of our perspectives. And we got to a point where we realized that when something came up, when a question came up, each of us would approach that question from our own personal styles, but we almost inevitably came to the same answer. So I guess that's part of how, that awareness and of course seeing the data, the evidence, and the experiments were very persuasive. You start off with an intuition or a feeling, but you're not quite sure you trust it. And then you just see this repeated under controlled conditions, and like, wait a minute, I'm not imagining this. And this now reassures me about experiences I might have had that were out of the ordinary in some ways. You gain confidence in your own intelligence and your own interpretations as you see the scientific side of the equation augmenting the subjective experience. One thing I think that is necessary as we move forward and try to create a new paradigm or a new picture of reality is that we don't want to throw away the old. We want to expand upon it. I think it would be a big mistake to discard science and say, let's go to spirituality and that can explain everything. It can't, any more than science can explain everything. There's an understanding, like with Einstein's equations, that show that mass and energy are exchangeable. There are scientific evidence that indicate there's a similar connection between energy and matter. But now we're in a world of information. This is what you might call the third currency of science. But information has an aspect that mass and energy may have, but we haven't recognized. Namely, information has both a subjective and an objective aspect, okay? Information, I can take information and I can digitize all of the information and say in a piece of music, a musical score. And that's information, but what does it mean? Does it explain the feeling you have when you listen to this piece of music, or the experience you have when you observe a work of art? That's subjective. And that is as much a part of consciousness and as much a part of human experience as the other. So we need to find a balance. I think we need to look for a complementary approach, not a dualistic one that says it must be either or, but to say that these are just two ways of looking at the same thing. One example I have sometimes given is what I call my grapefruit paradigm. If you have a grapefruit and you slice it and you look at it and you see these two halves with these star shapes, and then you cut another one and this is what a grape, and then one day you cut it that way and you look at it and you say, oh, this is a different kind of grapefruit. I have just discovered a new subspecies of grapefruit, and I know that this one with the star shape has a dominant genetic thing, and the recessive one is the, and I can write a paper. I could probably even get that paper published in Nature. And I'm so insistent that these are two kinds of grapefruit. It doesn't occur to me that it's all a question of how I've sliced the thing. And that's what I think experience is about. We are trained in our education, in our culture, to think in terms of, or to experience on an analytical level. What do you call it? How do you measure it? How often? But we forget that all of these tools are merely ways that we have developed to explain or describe an experience that we have had subjectively. And we have to move back to that. We have to develop and encourage imagination. We have to recover the sense of wonder at the world, the ability to experience it directly, and then recognize that our descriptions are just that. They are descriptions. So any scientific model, therefore, is not a description of the physical world. It's a description of how consciousness describes its experience of the physical world. So now consciousness is up there in a much more dominant place, and the subjective and objective sides of it become very complementary instead of dualistic. Poof to the mind-body problem. The relationship with the human operators is a very important part of our work. And unfortunately, if you're writing up a technical paper, you can describe the protocol, the analytical, what statistics, the measurements. But frequently, all you can say is, we attempted to make our human operators comfortable, or we regarded them as collaborators. It was not just. It was a very important aspect of what we did, because we felt that the work we were doing at the lab was not just looking at a human operator looking at a device. It was a gestalt. It was something that involved everybody. It involved the staff. It involved the physical environment. It involved the state of mind. This is why it was very helpful to tell them that they shouldn't suffer from metaphysical delusions, because they laughed. That was why we had toys, we offered cookies, but most importantly, we valued their opinions. They were part of the team. And as an example of why this is important, we had a colleague in Canada, he was an optics physicist, who thought it would be interesting to see if he could carry out an experiment based on this double slit experiment, which is a well-known optical process. So we said, sure, go ahead. We even helped him get some funding for the program, and he built this device and he did his experiments, and he got no results at all. And he called us some months later and said, this isn't working. I'm going to bring you, do you want this system? Because I don't want it, I'll just throw it out. And we said, no, by all means, bring it back here, we'll take a look at it. And he brought it down, and he showed us how it worked. And I said to him, now explain what you would tell a subject or a participant. Imagine, well, okay, he launched into this very long, very boring lecture on optics. My eyes were rolling in my head. I didn't know what he was talking about. And then he paused and said, there are some people who think you can actually influence this sort of thing. And I said to myself, well, now I know why you didn't get any results. You have just created a division, a distinction between the experimenter and the participant. We would never do that. We would say, and in fact, we kept it. We told some of our participants, we said, we've got this new experiment. I don't know much about it. It has something to do with light going through it, but basically you just want to get this bar to go up or down. And if you want to know more about the actual physics of it, people on our staff can explain it to you. And they said, no, that was fine. You just want me to make the bar? That would be fun. So we did some experiments. We got lovely results on that. And of course, this offended our physicist friend, because what was going on was right there at the core. This question about what is the nature of the relationship. Our participants were our friends. They were our colleagues. They were respected. Their opinions were valued. His subjects, or me experimenter, you subject, and you know, there are some people, oh, are you one of those? There was no way he was ever going to get results with that approach. So yes, cultivating that dynamic and that relationship is central. And it's why we have continued to maintain this so-called PEAR tree, which is an association of people who have been associated with our work over the years and have become good friends and remained colleagues. And this is precious. To me, this community is just as precious and just as important as the database that we accumulated. Maybe in some respects it may be more important. You know, where would we be 100 years from now? It depends how I slice that grapefruit. If I slice it one way, I can look down the road and say, you know, we're at an end. We're going to destroy our environment. We are going to turn ourselves into machines and robots because we're going to be putting chips in ourselves. We're not going to be able to think creatively or imaginatively. And that's just the road to the extinction of our species. That's one kind of slice of the grapefruit. I slice it the other way, I can say, you know, right now we are observing the disintegration of a system that we've had for several hundred years, but when we look at the big picture, this kind of change proceeds all the time. And maybe it's time for this system to come apart, because at the same time there are people, there are organizations, communities like we have here today, that are coming together and creating something new and bigger, a new network, a new social structure. There's a great the quote, I think I may have mentioned this, from Friedrich Nietzsche. He said, "Without tombs, there can be no resurrections." So we're seeing this yin-yang dynamic, I think, going on. I hope that ultimately it will come to a balance, as it always has, and some new approach, some new cultural paradigm, some new humanity will emerge from that, who can work together, who have learned how to be communal, who have learned to respect one another instead of hating one another, who have recognized this interdisciplinary, this perspective, the syntropy that draws together in affection and in love instead of the separation that divides people. Hey, it's a random process, and I know about random processes. You've got a theoretical process, 50, and but the reassuring note in all of that is that in our experiments we learned that if you can just change a few bits per thousand, you can shift the mean of a random distribution. I think that's all we can probably hope for. I don't think we're going to create a whole new species, but I think maybe the mean will shift a little bit. If there are a few more people, a few more consciousnesses that are working from the perspective of attraction instead of repulsion, that's my optimistic half of the grapefruit.